happy to be on this webinar, and we are grateful to all of you for making time for this. I'm excited about getting to know about climate financing and what it's all about. And I'm sure for each of us, every day is a learning day. We are getting to know new things, what's happening in the world, what are the new trends. There's been so much talk about going green, carbon emissions, saving the planet, and just being conscious about environmental degradation. So I think this discussion or this webinar comes at an opportune time, especially when when climate financing and green aspects are on an everyday coming in everyday discussion. And also we have the pleasure of hosting the Africa Climate Summit. Kenya is hosting the Africa Climate Summit next week. And a couple of delegates drawn from various parts of the globe will be coming in. So what an opportunity time to be having this discussion. So welcome. We hope that it will be beneficial to you. It will be informative, as Leanne mentioned, and that there'll be some takeaways from this and that will be able to add value. So at this point in time, I'll then bring in the panelist, Lydia Mwithiga, who's a seasoned finance expert and who then has chosen to focus or specialize in climate finance. And she'll tell us more about why climate finance and what it's all about. And we'll then be able to get additional information from her through the Q&A session. So Lydia, welcome. Let me give you the floor so that you can introduce yourself. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Steve, for inviting me to this webinar. I'm very excited to be here because climate finance is something I'm very passionate about, because I believe it's it's central to climate action. So my background is in finance, like you rightly said. I've worked in finance, in insurance, and in banking for over 10 years. And in 2019, I decided to switch a little bit and go into the climate change space, because I believe there's so much to be done in tackling the impacts of climate change. We can all see around us within our own country and also in other countries around the world, the devastating impact of climate change and how it's affecting us. So I'm very happy to be here, and I hope that this webinar will help to shed some light in terms of those who are joining us today, having understood or known a little bit about climate financing. So thank you so much again for inviting me.
Great, thanks. It's a pleasure to have you on this forum, Lydia. Now, we'd like to understand, and please don't think of us as experts as yourself. Please think of us like, you'd be teaching a second grader on what climate finance is. So just to get an overview of what climate financing is, maybe we start with what climate change is, and then by extension, what climate finance is and why it is so important today.
Okay, so thank you very much. And no worries, I'll not be very technical because, like I said, this is a journey I've just started about 4 years ago, but I'm very passionate about it. So my background has been in putting together books, accounting, So so climate change, for just your understanding, is what we see around us is the weather, is the extreme weather that we are now experiencing, which is I would say it's weather that can be attributed to over 100 years, the changes in the weather patterns. So what we see today are extreme weather patterns. We see more droughts, we see more flooding, we see extreme heat waves, especially in Europe during this summer season. We've seen the hurricane as the one that hit America yesterday. So all those are extreme weather events, which is what is referred as climate change. Now, climate finance, on the other hand, is resources or investments that are geared or are focused on climate action. And what do you mean by climate action? It means it refers to the climate mitigation and adaptation actions. When you talk about mitigation, we are referring to those activities or investments that go towards cutting carbon emissions that result in climate change. While climate adaptation is the adaptation or creating of resilience of people and ecosystems to climate change impacts.
Great. Thank you, Lydia. Yeah, we've experienced the effects of extreme weather conditions. We've seen the melting of ice in the Arctic areas, and we've also seen the flooding or the hurricanes in the east coast of the US. I think it's in Florida and the Carolinas. I don't know why the hurricanes are named after women. I don't know. Maybe you have some context around it. But yeah, we've seen those effects. And even closer home, we are seeing the Met Department spoke about El Nino that should be coming, should be with us soon. So definitely we see the effects of climate change. And from at least my understanding is that you're saying that climate financing is then the resourcing or the mobilizing of resources towards tackling these effects or mitigating. And thank you for that overview. So the next question I have for you is just trying to understand, now that it's resource mobilization, what are the various sources of climate finance and how have they evolved over the years?
Okay, thank you for that. So before I get into the sources, perhaps it's good to understand the difference between climate finance and any other conventional financing. So climate finance differs from the other traditional or the financing as we know it, in the sense that it is focused on those activities or projects that help to deal with or tackle climate change. So in the real sense, it just goes to say that it is not so different from the finance that we know. The only difference is that at the end of the day, the person who is investing climate finance must be able to see some results in terms of how much carbon emissions were reduced or how has that finance helped people to be more adaptive to climate change. So then the other difference also that separates climate finance from the other finance is where this money is sourced. Traditionally, climate finance has been sourced from public sources. Public sources here, we mean the governments, and particularly the developed developed countries' governments that are required under the Paris Agreement to support the developing countries with finance. So typically then these governments are supposed to allocate some of their own resources towards climate action in their own countries, but more support those countries that are more vulnerable and also do not have as much resources as they have. So, but we all know that governments are not very good investing. So a lot of times, most of this funding is given to the multilateral development institutions, the development finance institutions, those are the DFIs, the bilaterals, who then lend or provide this money to governments or invest in large projects, for example, the large infrastructure and renewable projects. Then you find that also then these institutions also cannot be able to fund the small businesses or small projects. So the way then that money flows, it's given to intermediaries. Intermediaries here, we mean the commercial banks like we have here in Kenya. It's given to investment funds, like investment funds, impact funders, such as those that Investia must be supporting, or microfinance institutions. So these institutions then are able to go lower and provide funding then to small businesses, to individuals, to small projects. And that way then climate finance has the kind of impact that is required to have. I must note that I must then also let you know that currently we have a huge climate finance gap, including for our country here in Kenya. Kenya, for example, estimates, according to the goal it has set for itself of cutting the emissions by 32% by the year 2030, Kenya estimates to spend about $62 billion to finance climate action in Kenya. But out of that, 13% is supposed to come from the domestic market. That is allocation from the government budget and also from the private sector. And the balance of 87 is supposed to come from the international sources. These are the public sources, the private sector sources, but international, which then goes to mean that where this money comes from, we cannot fully depend on the public sources to provide all the financing that we need, that the private sector also does need to contribute some money. And we also have other institutions like the philanthropy institutions also that have been contributing some sizable amount of climate finance.
Great. Thank you, Lydia. So I'm just wondering, you mentioned that some of these funds are channeled through intermediaries like banks and such other financial institutions. But maybe there could be an awareness. I think there's an awareness challenge, because I haven't seen banks advertise or go public about the funds that they have for climate finance. And so I don't know what your experience has been around that, and how you think we can be able to change that narrative. Is it from the financier who then needs to make it clear to the intermediaries that, look, you need to then make noise about this so that the public knows? Or is it, what do you think is a way that can ensure that, we can ensure that there's much awareness around it?
I agree with you, Steve, and thank you for that question. That the awareness of climate finance or climate action has been pretty low in our country and also around the world. And a lot of the climate action or initiatives has been majorly with the governments. It's only now that it has started to be escalated downwards. Now, in Kenya, we do have some financial institutions that already have allocated some of their capital towards climate or green financing. We have, for example, KCB that has committed to increase, I can't remember very well, about 25% of its loan portfolio will be green by the year 2030. Just recently, I also saw that NCBA Bank has also allocated about $30 million, I think, towards green financing. So we do have some of these local commercial banks already providing the green finance, but there is lack of awareness to the public, and this is because for most banks also, they've also been in the process of developing their own strategies around the green financing and developing the kind of products that are supposed to be purely targeting green investments. So there's some traction, but certainly there's a long way, there's a lot that still needs to be done in terms of creating the awareness. But I think now there's some good progress, which also has been informed, or rather initiated, by the central bank, because as you're aware, in 2021, the central bank issued the climate risk management guidelines for the banks that requires banks to, one, put together strategies for green financing, and also start disclosing on the climate risk, to start having climate risk disclosures. So that then has now ignited the banks that are thinking about climate financing, or green financing, if you'd call it. So I think beginning this year and the years to come, we'll see more traction and more awareness, because if the banks are going to lend to their customers, it means they will have to educate them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lydia. And so I'm just thinking, okay, for our for the audience, I think please take note. Lydia has mentioned KCB and NCBA as at least one of the two of the financial institutions where you can get funding for climate related projects. But Lydia, so on the one hand, there's getting to know the sources of getting the funding, but on the other, there's also getting to know how your project qualifies, because I'm thinking that it is also crucial for at least this discussion for the audience to understand, for example, how then would my project qualify for this kind of funding. And maybe if you can just shed some light around that, how then do we say this is should I say a green project, or a project that qualifies for climate financing?
Okay, thank you. So to answer that question, I think I'll take us back to the definition of climate finance. So it's those investments that are purely focused on climate action. So what that means then, if you have a project that you're looking for green finance, it must be able to demonstrate that the outcome of that project is, one, whether it's going to be reducing or cutting emissions. So we are talking, let's say, for example, you have an innovation for electric mobility, for example, e-mobility. So of course, what you're trying to say is that you're moving away. The vehicles are not going to be using fossil fuel. Instead, they're going to be, the energy they're going to be using is going to be electric. So there you can be able to demonstrate how much emissions you're going to be removing from the atmosphere. It could be in the agricultural sector. So you'll be saying, I'm no longer going to use, for example, the nitrogen fertilizers, which we know emit they emit emissions that are harmful. But instead, we are going to be using organic fertilizers. In that case, it's very easy for you to demonstrate how much of that nitrous emissions you are going to be able to remove from the atmosphere. If you are using, you're doing irrigation, and maybe you're using diesel to provide power to your pumps, then you see you're going to be using solar pumps, then of course, then it's very easy to demonstrate that. So at the end of the day, for your project to meet the criteria of being green or climate relevant, it must be able to demonstrate that the outcome or the result is either going to be creating resilience or it is going to be cutting emissions. So there is criteria. Ordinarily, when you go to a bank or an investment fund is giving you funding that is considered green, it will give you the criteria. So you must then be able to tick those boxes to qualify for those green finance.
Great.
Yeah.
Go on, sorry, Lydia, go on.
Yes. So you have also initiatives by governments of then defining the criteria of what could be considered green. I know in Kenya now there is an initiative to develop a green taxonomy. That taxonomy is going to define what qualifies to be green. For those who've interacted with international markets, we have like the EU Green Taxonomy. If you download that just from the internet, it will tell you what is a green infrastructure, what is sustainable finance, what is considered renewable energy. So it defines for you very clearly. So when you are developing or coming up with your project, then you would then be making sure that you fit within that criteria.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think it's good that you mentioned that it's in terms of qualifying, a project qualifying is not only restricted to one sector. It could be agri, it could be transport, it could be real estate as well. So if we move on to, I know you mentioned that you already highlighted that climate finance then differs from traditional funding. But then I'm just wondering, so to the extent that you want to mitigate against climate change effects, is a climate financing cheaper? I mean, I'm thinking there must be incentives towards going for climate finance as opposed to traditional funding.
The answer to that is yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I think the source of where that climate finance is going to come from is what will determine the cost of that finance. So from public sources, that's the governments or the multilaterals, a lot of that green finance is in form of grants, which means then it's money you're given to invest and you need not refund that money or repay it back. Or it could be in concessional loans, which means then that the interest rates, it's below the market rate. Now, we all know, in as much as we would like to have just the grants and the concessional loans fund the climate action, we do not have enough money to go around. Already, even with the existing, with the currently available climate finance, a lot still needs to be done to bridge the huge climate financing gap we have here in Kenya and around the world. So, and that's then calls for the private sector involvement in providing this climate finance. So the private sector providing the climate finance, and they play quite a significant role. For example, in the first landscape of climate finance flows in Kenya, in 2017-2018, the private sector provided 41% of 241 billion climate finance in Kenya. But for the private sector to provide this finance, it means then that they must be making good returns on that money, which means then it has to be market rate, because at the end of the day, in as much as they wanted to have a positive income on the environment, outcome on the environment and on people, it also means that they must be able to demonstrate the returns they made, or they must make a profit out of it. So private sector then finance usually would be market, or it would mean investment in equity, yeah, where you do not need to repay that money. But as continually, then what we continue to see the trend is then the public sector then coming in to provide guarantees, which guarantees, or what we call blended finance, which blended would mean they would invest in a project at its pilot stage, yeah, which means it would be mitigating the perceived risks of a new project. And that way, they are able to catalyze now private sector funding, which then would be at market rate. And or maybe rates that the margin is not too high, because then already the risk aspect of that project will have been covered. So that's how now the public sector kind of funding is helping to catalyze the private sector. But we do also have the funding from the philanthropies also. A lot of times also it tends to be either in form of grants or in form of concessional loans. But then again, it's still not sufficient enough that we cannot fully rely on the grants only or the concession. We still have to have those projects that can also be able to make good enough returns to be able to repay those loans.
Okay.
Yes,
so
I hope I don't know if I've answered you okay, yeah.
Extensively.
Extensively, yes.
Yes, you've
Yes.
answered extensively, and at least
Okay.
you've then you've managed to clarify for me at least that it's not that it's necessarily cheap money or free money, but there could be some concessions around the cost, around the costing. But I'm sorry, and just for our audience, please feel free to just put up your questions, any questions, clarifications you may want to seek, so that then at some point, then we'll just go through them and get Lydia to then give us more meat on whatever questions you may have. So Lydia, then moving on, at least you've shed some light on the roles that the governments play, and just to maybe dig deeper into that and connect it with also then private sector incentives to invest in climate friendly projects. I don't know whether maybe there will be tax incentives or tax holidays, or what then triggers the private sector to contribute to either climate financing, or to only engage in projects that are, would say, climate friendly.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for that question. So number one, I think the governments play a significant role in, first of all, not just providing the finance that's required towards climate action, but also creating an enabling environment, which then is supposed to catalyze the private sector investment. So when we talk about an enabling environment, one, we talk about development of policies or a legal framework. For example, in Kenya, we have a robust legal framework on climate change. We have the Climate Change Act. We have a climate change strategy. We have the nationally determined contribution, that is our NDC, which is our submission of the goals, our climate change goals for our country. Now, the other thing that governments do to create that enabling environment is also providing fiscal or incentives. In Kenya, we do have a draft fiscal or green incentive. This is supposed to be the kind of tax incentives that the government does offer to the private sector to just motivate them to invest in climate-related opportunities. We have, for example, incentives for the e-mobility sector, that is a transport sector, that I think to import the batteries, then they will not be attracting taxes. So, and various others. So the thing is with Kenya, just taking Kenya as an example, the biggest issue we have is uncertainty around the fiscal incentives. So we'll have in one government year, the government proposing tax incentives like we did have for solar energy some years back. Then in another year, the same is pulled out. So that uncertainty, of course, creates some barriers for investments by the private sector. But nonetheless, we can all understand also the challenges of raising public funds for the government to fund those very critical needs or expenditures for our country. So you can understand why they do that. But certainly having some sort of certainty that if these incentives is put in place, then perhaps it's going to be in place for a good number of years. So if you know, then as a private investor, if you put your money in such a project or an innovation, then you're sure in the next 10 years or so, you're going to be able to reap your benefits. But we do also have things like guarantees. We have the government itself offering some guarantees, which are meant to cushion the small, especially the SMEs, who are perceived to be very risky by the banks, which means then that with guarantees, it's possible then for banks to lend to projects that ideally they would not be able to, because they would think that the risk is too high for them to undertake. Yeah, so I think it's a critical role that governments play, and there's been quite a good number of initiatives around that. They are not enough, but I think as you move along and the conversations continue, and you also have push from the private to provide more and more of these incentives going forward.
Great. Thank you for that. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned e-mobility, because my next question was around the industries or sectors where the private sector investment is particularly crucial for climate action. And maybe just to create some context, I've seen a lot of discussions around e-mobility, e-bikes. I think there's some project for that Safaricom is involved in for e-mobility and e-bikes. And I think that, in my view, though you can clarify, would be good in terms of then reducing carbon emissions, especially where, say, the border riders, for example, can convert from using fossil fueled bikes to e-bikes. But then according to you, what are the other sectors? And I think I'm thinking that it is important to ensure that whichever sector then the climate action is taking place, there's impact, and maybe to a larger extent affects especially the bottom of the pyramid. I know I've said a lot. I'm just hoping that my question is still making sense, or it's still clear in terms of the other sectors that we are looking at for climate action.
Yes, your question is quite clear. So yes. I think there is no single sector that we can say has has been able to bridge that climate finance gap. There's not a single one in Kenya or around the world. So we're talking from energy. Well, we do know our country, we are quite advanced. I think over 90% of all our energy would be considered renewable. But in as much as we have a significant proportion of our energy coming from renewables, it doesn't mean that that is sufficient. And why do I say? If we look at the level of electrification, especially in counties or in the rural areas, there's still a lot that needs to be done. So there is still some opportunity there to invest in the renewable energy sector in terms of maybe decentralized systems, solar energy for domestic use, especially in the rural areas. And if we are going to, and also taking into consideration that sectors impact each other. For example, if we are going to go the e-mobility direction, which we are, it also means we are going to require more energy to be able to power the electric vehicles. So if we are to just convert the vehicles, both commercial and personal use or public transport to electric, then you would find that we do not have sufficient energy to be able to power those vehicles. So there's still a lot that needs to be done. So, but we do have sectors, of course, that are lagging behind significantly. We have the agricultural sector, we have the water sector, we have the forestry sectors. We also have the manufacturing sectors. Now, when we think about the sectors which you rightfully mentioned that touch the bottom of the pyramid, here we are talking about people living in the informal sectors, you're talking about people living in the informal sectors. The common thing for all of them, for example, they all need is food and water. Yeah. So those are sectors that have significant opportunities, especially for the private sector, to invest green finance in them. And the impact they will have is going to impact more people, and people who are either vulnerable or because of their economic status, or where they're not able to be reached. So those are some of the sectors I think are quite critical and which have been receiving very little investment in Kenya and also around the world, but which are extremely critical for people.
Great. Thank you, Lydia. I like what you mentioned about the interconnectivity or the interlinking of sectors. For example, I remember there's a client that we're advising called Sun Culture, which does, they do solar-powered irrigation kits. And I think that then fits to your explanation around how, for example, the energy or power sector then interlinks with agri, and then that would fit in to this discussion we are talking about climate change and financing. And so, according to you, what are some of the innovative climate financing mechanisms or instruments that have gained traction recently?
Well, there are several, beginning with blended finance. And I spoke about it earlier. Blended finance is finance that you have a public sector, you have governments or multilaterals providing either grants or concessional loans to finance climate-related projects. And by so doing, then they're able to unlock the finance that's required to finance larger projects or to scale those projects. We do have, you've seen, and I know Investia is involved in the angel, in the investment funds, starting with the angel investors. So what is innovative about expanding the sources of climate finance to involve everybody within the chains of investment, starting all the way from the angel investors all the way to the large funds and to the commercial funds, is that with blended finance, that these investors are able to invest in projects that they would otherwise not be able to invest because they would be too scared of the risk involved. Then we have instruments such as green bonds, which are structured bonds, just like corporate bonds, but those that are purely focused on having positive environmental impact. Also coming on board. We have in Kenya, we had Acorn, and I saw you have done some work with them, issuing the first green bond in Kenya. And hopefully then in the coming years, we will also see other private sector institutions issuing those bonds, because it's also another way of being able to raise funding for green investments. We do also have we have investments in incubation centers, like we have the KCIC. Again, that is very critical. Again, this is investments that will go into helping people with innovative ideas to develop those ideas and to become big and to scale them into the future. So I would say that the innovations are coming along with people gaining more understanding of what would be considered as climate relevant investment, and also with an understanding, an increasing understanding by the private sector, especially, that green financing or climate financing is no longer a good thing to have, but it is a critical thing to do. That we are not going to get to where we are not going to tackle climate change if we do not provide the finance that's required to tackle it. So it's and also for private sector and also the public sector, realization that we must do something about climate change, which means we must provide the kind of finance that we need to have those initiatives or actions bearing fruit. Yeah, I think, yes, yeah.
Yeah, that one, yes, you've fully answered it, and thank you very much for that. I keep encouraging the audience, please put in your comments, questions, which we can tackle. I'm seeing we are running short of time, yet this is a very interesting discussion, and I'm enjoying this discussion very much. And as I wait for comments, questions, yeah, you've talked about the different instruments and mentioned green bonds. I don't know whether you can use climate bonds and green bonds interchangeably. You can clarify on that. And yes, we saw Acorn issue the first ever green bond for their student accommodation projects. So maybe just to zero in on the green bonds. So ideally, then from what you mentioned, that you're basically raising funds towards projects that have a climate change impact or mitigation to an extent. yeah, please just give more meat to that.
There's really not a made bond per se. I think what is commonly used is the green bonds, and the green bonds are basically those instruments which are mobilized funds that goes to projects that have a climate angle to them. That means that the outcome expected from that investment is either cutting emissions or creating resilience. So yeah, I don't know if I got what was your other question?
No. So at least you've clarified. So the
Yes.
term green bonds
Yes.
just applies to climate bonds, and so I was just commenting that for it to qualify as a green bond, then it means that the project has to have some elements of climate change mitigation around it.
Correct, yes. Or climate adaptation.
Or climate adaptation. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I would like to point out, I think I left this earlier, that what again differentiates climate finance from the conventional finance is that it has reporting requirements. And why that is so critical is because the investors do not want to put their money into a project which will not result in what it is expected to result to. So you will find that if you're issuing a green bonds, number one, you will have, before you are even it is approved for investment or for listing, you will have independent verifiers verify that indeed how that funding is going to be utilized will actually result in either climate mitigation or adaptation at the end of the day. Then the investors then require periodic reporting of the progress. So you have to report to them, if you had said that you're cutting emissions, how much have you cut? How much have you improved the environment? So there has to be things that you periodically have to report on, so that then it is able to achieve the kind of objective it was meant to have at the end of the day.
Okay. And
Yeah.
Lydia, would you argue that this reporting requirements and whatever else compliance requirements would then increase project costs, or would that maybe a project sponsor or developer will then shy away from just going green because of just the extra level of costs, or there's a way in which then the benefits would outweigh the costs?
Yeah, definitely. It does impact the cost of raising the funds, because then the verification processes and the reporting processes require technical expertise, which is not going to come in cheap. So, but where then you have then incentives, the kind of incentives you're talking about before, where you have incentives or you have guarantees provided by the DFIs or the NDBs towards this kind of instruments, they really do come in handy to reduce those costs. But without them, then of course, then it means ultimately the amount that the funding cost is going to be higher, which then makes it less attractive, which in our case here in Kenya, it's one of the barriers of raising a green bond, for example. So going forward, I think the most important thing for investors then to recognize is that the cost of not investing in climate action is actually higher in the medium to the long term. Yeah. And a lot of the projects that we invest that to be considered green, you may not be able to realize the benefits immediately, but they have long-term benefits. So the kind of then finance, and that's why a lot of times it's either concession or in grant form, is supposed to be some patient kind of capital, because then you must have the patience to wait to see the benefits. Yeah.
Mhm.
But whether the critical thing to note is that whether we invest, investing is actually not a choice. It's something we have to do, because what we are seeing now, if we don't do something, we'll see worse devastations, coming from the climate change impacts. What we are seeing today, for example, what the hurricane in America yesterday, they were saying they haven't experienced something like that in 125 years. So if they're experiencing those losses every year, then you can then see the resulting losses are actually worse than if we invested today, instead of then having to pay for those the loss of property, people's lives, and things like that.
I'm seeing we're at the top of the hour, and the discussion is just getting more juicy. Yeah? even as Lydia, you sort of threaten us around, no, if we don't take care of our environment, we are likely to see more devastation going forward. But I think it's the right message to pass across, in the sense that we must take responsibility for our actions, and ensure that at least we are not contributing towards the environmental degradation, which then would impact climate change. I see we are at the top of the hour. I don't know, Leanne, whether we should call it, or if there's a 1-2 minute window just to conclude. Leanne?
1 or 2 minute window.
1 or 2 minute window. Yeah. So, Lydia, I don't know what you'd give as your parting shot or closing remarks, because I'm thinking it has been a very interesting discussion, very informative and very engaging. Lydia.
Okay, thank you very much. I see we have one question from Kelvin.
Yes, sorry.
Two questions. Yes, yes. So maybe I can answer that before I can give my closing remarks. Yes. So he wants to know if climate change is a hoax, that as he's seen a lot of that coming on the internet. And I would just like to say, no, climate change is not a hoax. And we can all see, if you speak to, for those of us who come from the rural areas, they will all tell you that what the weather events they're experiencing today is not what was there before. What you can see on TV, and lucky for us now, we can see what's happening around the world. The heat waves that were experienced in Europe, the wildfires, the hurricanes in Americas and in the island nations, they are not the normal weather events. These are extreme weather events, and they have been worsening over the time. And I would like to refer you to the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change reports that they are issued on an annual basis. And there is science to prove that indeed that climate change is happening. And the main reason for that is the emissions that we as individuals are contributing to, by how we consume, by how we travel, by just our daily activities. So we have to do something about it. Then in terms of your second question is considering the many Paris Agreement signatories. Yeah, no, you raise a very good question about the commitment of the developed countries to provide the kind of finance that is required by the developing countries. The Paris Agreement required that the developed countries provide 200 billion annually to the developing countries towards climate action. And I think as at COP27 last year, I think only about 87 billion had been provided. Of course, that goes to shows a lack of commitment, but there is also a lot of politics around climate change and who is responsible for it. For us, the responsibility as it is laid on the developed countries because their industrialization is, of course, what led to the increase in the emissions that have caused now the climate change impacts that we see today. So by virtue of that, they are provide that funding. So about is how do we get this money flowing? And the primary focus actually of the climate summit, the Africa Climate Summit that's taking place in Nairobi from next week is actually going to be focusing on how do we unlock this climate finance to come and fund climate action in Africa. So it's an ongoing, there is politics involved, but there is also the fact that also this, which of course we have economic recession, we also have them being heavily impacted by climate change also. They have huge impacts. So you could then imagine also their funding is also limited. So those conversations continue. So I think to me, and these are my closing remarks, is that we are not going to achieve the goals set out in the Paris Agreement of maintaining temperature rises to below 2% by the year 2050. And if we are not going to provide the finance that's required to implement those actions on the ground, and especially in the developing countries. But the responsibility is not only, it doesn't only lie on the developed countries to provide that finance to the developing countries or the governments to provide that money. It also lies on the private sector also to provide this money so that together it becomes our owner. Every sector takes an ownership of being part of that solution. And that way, I think we are going to achieve more.
Great. Thank you, Lydia. I think we'd want to have this conversation continue, but unfortunately we are constrained for time. Leanne, apologies that we've overshot the runway somewhat, but at least the discussion has been very informative and very beneficial. On my part, I'd like to say thank you very much, Lydia, for committing your time to this. And I'm hoping that everyone has gained tremendous value from this discussion. And that you've also let us know that we each must take responsibility in this climate change discussion. Back to you, Leanne, in studio.
Thank you, our speaker today, Lydia and Ogada. It's been a pleasure, and thank you to everyone who made time. The video will be the recording will be available on our YouTube channel, that is Investia Africa Limited. Thank you. Bye. Have a good day.
Bye.